The rain was falling heavily on that cold night. Eduardo, a successful businessman known for his arrogant manner, left the luxury restaurant where he had dined with important clients. He was irritated by a negotiation that had not gone as expected. As he walked quickly towards his car, adjusting his umbrella against the wind, his eyes caught something that seemed out of place. Under the awning of a closed store, a woman was hugging a baby wrapped in a worn blanket. The woman, with disheveled hair and soaked clothes, looked up at Eduardo in despair. "Please, sir, anything will help," she begged, her voice almost drowned out by the sound of the rain. Eduardo hesitated for a brief moment. Something about the scene touched him, but he quickly shook it off. "I'm sorry, but there's nothing I can do," he replied curtly, looking away and quickening his pace. As he got into his car and closed the door, he tried to convince himself that she was just another beggar in the city, someone he had no obligation to help. "It's not my problem," he muttered as he started the engine. However, as he drove home, the image of the woman lingered in his mind. He wondered how anyone could end up in that situation. Was she an opportunist? But what if she wasn't? As these questions tormented him, he arrived at his luxurious apartment and tried to go about his daily routine. He made himself some coffee and opened his laptop to review some reports, but he couldn't concentrate. The image of the baby wrapped in the blanket wouldn't leave him alone. He tried to ignore the discomfort, but as the night wore on, the discomfort grew. When he finally fell asleep, Eduardo was haunted by a dream. In it, the woman in the rain stretched out her arms toward him, the baby crying inconsolably. Eduardo woke up with a start, his heart racing and his face sweaty. He sat up in bed, staring into the darkness of the room. For the first time in a long time, he felt a genuine uneasiness in his soul. It took him a while to process what he was feeling. He wondered if he shouldn't go back to the place where he had seen her. Maybe she was still there, needing help. But at the same time, Eduardo found himself debating with himself. What if I'm being naive? What if she's not who she seems? Despite this, an inner voice insisted, "You have to do something." The next morning, Eduardo woke up with a restlessness he couldn't ignore. The image of the woman and the baby in the rain seemed to be etched in his mind, like a portrait that refused to fade. He tried to follow his usual routine, but every gesture seemed devoid of purpose. The hot coffee that used to energize him tasted bitter, and even the financial news that usually captured his attention sounded distant. Eduardo glanced at the clock on the wall, realizing that it was still early. An idea began to take shape in his head. Although he tried to resist it, he needed to go back to that place. Not quite sure what he was looking for, Eduardo left the house. The weather was still cloudy, with the sky heavy, as if the rain could start at any moment. He drove through the busy city streets, but this time, every traffic light, every slow-moving car in front of him seemed like an annoying obstacle. When he finally reached the spot where he had seen the woman the night before, he found only emptiness. The ground was still damp from the rain, and the footprints left by her and the baby had dissipated. He parked the car and got out, looking around as if expecting her to suddenly appear. Eduardo walked for a few blocks, observing every corner, every person who passed by, but nothing. Finally, he stopped in front of a small newsstand where an elderly man was sorting through worn magazines. "Did you see a woman with a baby around here last night? It was raining. She looked like she needed help." The vendor stared at him for a moment before answering. "Oh yes, she comes around here from time to time. A sad story that, but people get used to it. You know how it is." Those words hit Eduardo like a knife. Getting used to it? How can anyone get used to suffering? He thanked the man and continued walking, now with greater determination. After a while, he stopped next to a closed store where a small plastic bag was stuck in a nearby bush. Curious, he approached and opened the bag. Inside was an empty baby bottle and a folded piece of paper. When he opened the paper, he saw that it was a letter. The handwriting was simple and shaky, as if it had been written in a hurry. "I don't know how much longer I can hold on. I just want my baby to have a chance. He's all I have. Please don't judge what I've done." Eduardo read the words over and over, his heart heavy. There was a mixture of desperation and love in those lines that left him speechless. He put the letter in his pocket and he looked around once more. He couldn't give up now. This woman needed help, and he knew something bigger had put him on this path. Suddenly, his search wasn't just about finding the woman. It was about rediscovering something inside himself that had long been dormant. Eduardo walked through the neighborhood streets with slow steps, but his mind was buzzing. The letter he had found not only gave him clues about the woman, but also placed him before a responsibility he could no longer ignore. The crumpled paper in his pocket seemed to pulse, as if it carried the weight of the life of that mother and her baby. He knew he couldn't go back home without at least trying to find her again. As he walked, he observed his surroundings carefully, noticing details that would have gone unnoticed before. The tired faces of the people, the children playing barefoot on the sidewalks, the marks of a hard life imprinted on every corner. He decided to ask other shopkeepers and residents of the area. He approached a small bakery, whose aroma of fresh bread contrasted with the melancholy of the place. "Sorry to bother you, but I'm looking for a woman who was here last night. She was carrying a baby. Has anyone seen her?" The baker, a stout man in a flour-stained apron, paused for a moment and seemed to consider. "Oh yes, I know who you're talking about. She comes in here sometimes, buys a loaf of bread or two when she gets some money. But she never stays long. She always seems to be in a hurry. And today? Was she here?" Eduardo asked, feeling his heart race. "Not that I've seen her, but I heard that she usually goes through the alley next to the market when she needs to rest." Wasting no time, Eduardo followed the instructions, arriving at the alley mentioned. The place was narrow, with dirty walls and scattered crates, but there were signs that someone had been there recently. A hastily folded blanket and the remains of a can of baby milk. He knelt down, took the blanket in his hands, and smelled a soft perfume mixed with the odor of the street. It was another clue, and although he wasn't sure where to look next, he felt he was on the right track. As he stood there, an elderly woman appeared carrying a shopping cart. Her curious eyes fixed on Eduardo, and she asked, "Are you looking for someone, young man?" He nodded and explained about the woman and the baby. The woman nodded in understanding. "She's young, isn't she? Always so worried about that baby. I saw her heading toward the little square last night. Maybe you'll find her there." Eduardo thanked her and quickly headed toward the indicated square. It was a small space, with rusty benches and trees that provided little shade. There, children ran and played, and a few mothers sat chatting. But Eduardo saw no sign of the woman. He sat on a bench, trying to gather his thoughts. Was he doing enough? Was he being guided by something greater, or was he just trying to ease his own conscience? Before he could delve deeper into his thoughts, a small, thin boy with bright eyes approached him. "Are you looking for the lady with the baby?" Eduardo was surprised and asked how the boy knew. "I heard you asking Mrs. Marta in the alley. She's my neighbor. I saw the woman with the baby heading to the bus station earlier today. I think she was running away from someone." Those words set off an alarm bell in Eduardo. Running away? From whom or what? He thanked the boy and ran to his car. Now more than ever, he felt that time was against him. He had to get to the bus station before it was too late. Eduardo drove through the busy streets toward the bus station, his heart racing and his hands tight on the steering wheel. Each red light seemed like an unbearable obstacle, a delay he couldn't allow. His mind was full of questions. Why would that woman be running away? What could possibly lead her to abandon everything and seek refuge in such an uncertain place? He knew that his search had stopped being just an impulse of compassion. Now it was a mission, almost as if he were trying to rescue something lost within himself. Arriving at the bus station, Eduardo hurriedly parked his car and got out, feeling the cold morning breeze mixed with the deafening noise of buses, street vendors, and hurried passengers. The place was crowded, and every face seemed like a potential clue. He walked among the people, his eyes scanning every corner, every bench, looking for the woman and her baby. His heart sank with each step he took without finding them, but he refused to give up. Suddenly, in the corner of his peripheral vision, Eduardo saw a movement that caught his attention. A woman was sitting on a bench at the end of one of the platforms, with a baby in her arms and a small bag by her side. She looked exhausted, her head tilted forward, as if the weight of the world was on her shoulders. Eduardo, he paused for a moment, trying to confirm that it was her. When he saw her adjust the baby's blanket, he was sure. He walked toward her, his heart racing. As he got closer, The woman looked up and recognized him immediately. Her eyes widened, and she hugged the baby tighter, as if expecting the worst. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice shaking between fear and surprise. Eduardo raised his hands in a gesture of peace, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. "I came to help," he said, sincerity shining through his words. "Please don't be afraid. I found your letter, and I couldn't ignore it." She looked confused and relieved at the same time, but still reluctant. "Why would you do that? You don't know me, or what I'm going through," she replied, her voice thick with suspicion. "Maybe I don't know," Eduardo admitted, sitting down on the bench next to her. "But I saw you yesterday in the rain, and something inside me changed. I can't explain it, but I felt like I had to do something." The woman looked down at the baby, who was sleeping peacefully in her arms. A heavy silence fell between them before she finally began to speak. "My name is Sophia," she said softly, "and I'm running away from the man who was supposed to be the father of my child. He's dangerous, and I just want to protect my baby." Eduardo listened to every word carefully, feeling a mix of anger and compassion. "No one should live in this much fear," he replied, his voice firm. "If you'll let me, I want to help. We can find a safe place for you and your child." Sophia hesitated, her eyes shining with tears that she seemed determined to hold back. "I don't know if I can trust you," she said, her voice cracking with uncertainty. Eduardo looked into her eyes, trying to convey all the sincerity he felt. "I understand, but please give me a chance. I won't leave you alone." Sophia looked at Eduardo, still unsure, but something in the way he spoke rang true. She wasn't used to meeting people who wanted to help her without asking for something in return, but at that moment, physical and emotional exhaustion outweighed her distrust. Without saying anything, she adjusted the baby in her arms and sighed deeply. Eduardo, sensing her hesitation, tried to ease the tension. "I know you have reasons to distrust me, but please understand that I'm not here by chance. You and your baby deserve a chance to start over." Sophia looked away, as if those words had awakened something in her. "You don't understand," she finally said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "I believe in other people before, and they've all let me down. My son's father promised to take care of us, but when things got tough, he abandoned us. He said I was a burden and that the baby would only complicate his life." Her words were filled with pain, and Eduardo could sense how deep the woman's suffering was. "He didn't know what he was missing," Eduardo replied, his voice full of conviction. "And I want to prove to you that not everyone is the same. You don't have to carry this burden alone anymore." Sophia remained silent, holding the baby tighter. It was as if she was fighting an internal battle, trying to decide if it was worth trusting again. Suddenly, the baby stirred in her arms and began to cry. Sophia, immediately going into protective mode, began to rock him gently, murmuring soothing words. Eduardo watched this scene with a mixture of admiration and sadness. Her strength was evident, but it was also clear that she was at the end of her rope. "Look, I don't expect you to decide now," Eduardo said, breaking the silence. "But at least let me help you find a safe place to spend the night. There's a shelter nearby that can offer you food and a roof over your head." Sophia seemed to ponder her words, fighting against the pride that had always kept her going, even in the worst situations. Finally, she looked up at Eduardo, her face still marked by distrust, but with a spark of hope. "Okay, but if I notice anything wrong, I'll leave." Eduardo nodded, relieved. "You have my word. Let's go." He reached out to help Sophia up, but she refused, adjusting the baby herself and picking up her small bag. Still, he noticed that she was taking the first step toward accepting his help, even if hesitantly. They walked together through the bus station, attracting curious glances from strangers. Eduardo realized that, for the first time, he didn't care what others thought. What mattered was making sure that Sophia and the baby were safe. As they walked to the car, Eduardo noticed that Sophia kept looking around, as if she was expecting something bad to happen at any moment. He realized that the safety she was looking for wasn't just physical, but also emotional. It was as if she carried years of fear and disappointment on her shoulders. And in that moment, Eduardo made a silent decision. He would do everything in his power to prove that she could trust him again. Eduardo and Sophia walked in silence to the car. He opened the door for her, and she got in hesitantly, adjusting the baby in her arms as she looked around cautiously. Eduardo could feel the tension in the air, but he chose not to press her with any more questions. He knew that Sophia needed time to process the situation. As he started the car, the soft sound of the engine seemed to fill the void between them. As he drove through the busy streets, Eduardo tried to gather his thoughts. He was not the type to get involved in other people's problems, much less someone who would abandon his commitments to help a stranger. However, there was something about Sophia that made him want to be different, as if she were a mirror that reflected parts of himself that he preferred to ignore. Sophia watched the city pass by through the window, her eyes fixed on some distant point. Although she was physically present, her mind wandered to painful memories. She thought about the day her world had fallen apart, when she had been forced to leave everything behind because of a betrayal that had nearly destroyed her. The baby's father, once so loving and attentive, had turned out to be a selfish and cruel man, willing to do anything to keep his reputation intact. Sophia fled with her son in her arms, not knowing exactly where to go, but determined to protect him at any cost. Eduardo broke the silence. The place we're going is safe. It's not luxurious, but it will ensure that you have some peace. Sophia just nodded, saying nothing. She didn't want to create expectations, but a small part of her wished he was right. It wasn't easy to trust, but there was something different about Eduardo's words, something that made her armor begin to crumble, even if slowly. They arrived at a simple but well-kept building with a sign that said Family Support Center. Eduardo parked the car and got out first, opening the door for Sophia. She walked down slowly, holding the baby close to her chest as she looked at the building with curiosity mixed with skepticism. "Is this it?" she asked, her voice thick with doubt. Eduardo smiled slightly. "Yes, it is. Come, I'll introduce you to someone who can help." They were greeted by a middle-aged woman with a welcoming smile and warm eyes. "Welcome. I'm Clara, the coordinator of the center. How can I help you?" Eduardo stepped forward. "Clara, this is Sophia. She needs a safe place to stay with her baby. I hope you can help her." Clara immediately approached Sophia, examining her carefully but without judgment. "Of course we can help you. Come with me. I'll show you where you and your baby can rest." Sophia hesitated for a moment, looking at Eduardo. She still wasn't sure if she could trust him completely, but something in his gaze conveyed a security she hadn't felt in a long time. She nodded slightly, following Clara into the building. Eduardo stood outside, watching as she disappeared through the door. He felt a mixture of relief and concern. He had taken the first step to help her, but he knew that Sophia's journey was far from over. As Clara led Sophia through the corridors of the support center, Eduardo stood outside, watching the movement of the street. He wondered if he had done enough. The image of Sophia, so fragile and yet incredibly strong, remained etched in his mind. Eduardo had never felt so responsible for someone as he did at that moment. He had always believed that his life was complete, surrounded by luxuries and professional achievements, but now something seemed missing. He realized that, somehow, this journey with Sophia and the baby was beginning to fill that void. Inside, Sophia followed Clara with hesitant steps. The center had walls painted in soft colors, pictures with messages of hope, and a welcoming aroma of home-cooked food. It was a stark contrast to the places Sophia had usually frequented in the last few weeks. Clara led her to a small room, simple but clean, with a single bed, a crib, and a worn dresser. "It's not much, but it's a start," Clara said with a gentle smile. "Here you can rest, and tomorrow we could talk about what you need to move forward." Sophia looked around, her eyes taking in every detail of the room. It was humble, but it was more than she had expected to find. "Thank you," she murmured, feeling the words weigh heavy on her tongue. It wasn't easy for her to admit that she needed help, but at that moment, exhaustion overcame her pride. She placed the baby in the crib and watched him settle in with a quiet sigh. For the first time in a long time, he looked comfortable, and that was what she needed. Brought unexpected relief to Sophia. Clara quietly left, leaving Sophia alone with her thoughts. She sat on the bed, watching the baby sleep, and felt a wave of conflicting emotions. She was relieved to be in a safe place, but fear for the future still consumed her. She wondered how long this would last, if she could really trust Eduardo's intentions and the support of the center. Her life had always been marked by broken promises and people who left her when she needed them most. Outside, Eduardo decided to go in to check if everything was okay. Clara met him in the hallway and said, "She needs time to trust, but you did the right thing by bringing her here." Phew, people have that courage. Eduardo nodded, still feeling conflicted. He went to Sophia's room and knocked softly on the door. When she opened it, her face seemed calmer, but it still carried the shadow of someone who had lived through more struggles than he should have. "I just wanted to know if you're okay," he said hesitantly. Sophia looked at him, as if trying to decipher his intentions once again. "I'm better, thank you, and thank you for bringing me here." Eduardo smiled, relieved to see that she seemed to be starting to lower her defenses. "I just want to help, Sophia. You don't have to go through this alone." She just nodded, not sure what to say. For now, that was enough. The next morning, Sophia woke up to the soft sound of children's laughter echoing through the hallway. For a moment, she was disoriented, trying to remember where she was. The light that came in through the small window illuminated the modest but cozy room. She looked at the crib and saw that the baby was still sleeping soundly, his face as serene as she hadn't seen it in weeks. That temporary peace seemed almost unreal, as if it were a dream about to end. Getting up carefully so as not to wake him, Sophia went to the window. Outside, the center's courtyard was full of life. Children played, mothers chatted, and employees moved with clear purpose. She felt a glimmer of hope, but then pessimism took over. How long until this is over, she thought. Sophia had experienced the feeling of security before, only to have it crumble like a sandcastle. As she watched, someone knocked softly on the door. It was Clara, carrying a tray with breakfast. "Good morning, Sophia. I hope you had a good rest," she said with a warm smile. Sophia thanked her, accepting the tray and sitting on the bed. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and fresh bread reminded her of simpler times, when mornings were not filled with uncertainty. "Eduardo is here," Clara said after a brief silence. "He wants to know if you need anything." Sophia was surprised. She had not expected Eduardo to be so involved. Part of her wanted to reject the offer, but another, more tired part wanted to accept. "You can ask him to come in," she finally replied in a hesitant tone. Clara nodded and left. A moment later, Eduardo entered the room, looking a little out of place in the surroundings. He held a bag and placed it on the table. "I brought some things for you and the baby. Clothes, diapers, that kind of thing. I hope they'll be useful." Sophia looked at him, trying to decipher his intentions. "You really didn't have to do this," she said, her voice low. Eduardo smiled slightly. "Maybe I didn't have to, but I wanted to. You have a lot to worry about, and this is the least I can do." Sophia sighed, the barrier of distrust starting to give way. "Thank you. I'm not used to people who do something without wanting something in return." Eduardo approached, keeping his tone calm. "Sophia, I don't expect anything. I just want you to be okay. If you need anything, just tell me." Before she could answer, the baby started to cry. Sophia rushed to pick him up, but Eduardo intervened. "Let me help." Taking the baby in his arms, he rocked him gently until the crying stopped. Sophia watched with a mixture of amazement and admiration. It was the first time that someone other than her had seemed genuinely interested in caring for her son. When Eduardo handed the baby back to Sophia, she finally felt that maybe, just maybe, she could trust him. "You're different, Eduardo. I don't know why you're doing this, but thank you." He just smiled, without words, but in that smile there was a silent promise that he wouldn't abandon her. As the morning sun illuminated the courtyard of the support center, Sophia decided to leave the room for a moment. She needed to breathe, gather her thoughts, and try to understand everything that was happening. The baby, now fed and calm, rested in her arms, his warmth transmitting a sense of comfort that she hadn't felt in a long time. As she passed through the hallway, she heard the voices of the children playing outside and realized that, however temporary it was, This was the first time in weeks that she had felt any stability. In the courtyard, Eduardo was talking to Clara, who was gesturing as she pointed towards the building. They seemed to be discussing something important. Sophia hesitated before approaching, but it didn't take long for Eduardo to notice her presence. He smiled comfortingly, as if to show her that she was welcome there. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, walking towards her. Sophia nodded, not knowing quite how to respond. She was still getting used to having someone who genuinely seemed concerned about her. Clara broke the silence with her usual energy. "We were discussing some ways to help you. Eduardo suggested that perhaps we could find a more permanent place for you and the baby to stay, something that would be just yours." The words took Sophia by surprise. She couldn't imagine something like that happening. A place to call her own? It seemed too distant, almost impossible a dream. "I don't know what to say," she murmured, her voice breaking. "You're doing so much for me. I'm not used to this." Eduardo put his hands in his pockets and replied simply, "You don't have to say anything. We just want you to have a chance to start over." Despite the lingering suspicion, Sophia felt a warm glow in her chest. For the first time in a long time, there seemed to be a light at the end of the tunnel. As they talked, Clara suggested that Sophia spend some time with other mothers at the center who could help her feel more comfortable. Initially reluctant, Sophia eventually agreed, driven by curiosity to hear stories of women who, like her, were struggling to overcome challenges. Later, sitting in a circle of women in the courtyard, Sophia heard stories of courage and perseverance. One mother told how she fled an abusive relationship to protect her children. Another spoke of losing everything in a fire and starting over. Each story seemed to resonate with her own, and for the first time, she felt like she wasn't alone. The baby in her arms seemed to sleep more peacefully, as if even he could sense that this place was special. Eduardo watched from afar, pleased to see her interacting. He wasn't sure why he cared so much, but something about Sophia made him want to be better. Meanwhile, Clara approached him. "She still has a long way to go, but you're helping more than you can imagine," Clara said with an approving look. Eduardo just smiled, realizing that, little by little, it wasn't just Sophia who was changing. He was also rediscovering something he had long forgotten: the importance of connecting with people and making a difference. As the afternoon fell, Sophia sat under a tree in the center's courtyard, cradling her baby as she watched the sky slowly change color. The day had been different from any other she had experienced in the last few weeks. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel a spark of hope, although fear was still a constant companion. The stories she had heard from other mothers echoed in her mind, and she wondered if she too would have the strength to start over. Each word, each story of overcoming, seemed to shed light on her own situation, but at the same time, it awakened the insecurity that had accompanied her for so long. Eduardo appeared silently, bringing with him 2 cups of tea that Clara had prepared. He offered one to Sophia and sat down next to her, keeping a respectful distance. For a moment, neither of them said anything. They just contemplated the end of another day. The baby, nestled in Sophia's arms, was breathing calmly, and Eduardo found himself admiring the serenity that the scene conveyed. He didn't fully understand what motivated him to stay there, but he knew he couldn't just leave. "You seem to be a little calmer today," he commented softly, breaking the silence. Sophia looked at him and gave a small smile, something rare to see. "Yeah, I guess so. It's strange. I'm not used to places where people really care." Eduardo nodded, understanding the weight behind his words. "The world isn't always fair, Sophia, but I think that sometimes we cross paths with the right people. I don't know what you've been through, but maybe this is a new beginning." Sophia was silent for a few moments, looking at the baby. "I'm still scared," she admitted, her voice thick with honesty. "Scared of believing that everything will be okay and then losing it all again." Eduardo leaned forward slightly, holding his cup between his hands. "Fear is normal, but you don't have to face everything alone. We're here. I'm here." Eduardo's words touched something deep inside Sophia. She didn't know exactly what she felt for him, but there was something in the way he spoke, in the patience in his gestures, that made her lower her barriers, even though a little at a time. "Thank you," she said finally, her tone softer than any he had ever heard from her. It was a simple word, but Eduardo knew it carried a huge weight. As night fell, Clara appeared in the courtyard, carrying a blanket for Sophia and the baby. "It's getting cold. You can come in if you want," she suggested, with her usual gentleness. Sophia thanked her and stood up, adjusting the blanket around the baby. Eduardo also stood up, following her to the door. Before entering, she stopped and looked at him, hesitating. "Will you come back tomorrow?" she asked almost in a whisper. Eduardo smiled sincerely. "Yes, I will." Watching him leave, Sophia felt something new. For the first time in a long time, she began to believe that perhaps there was a way beyond the pain, and that in time, she could rebuild her life. It wouldn't be easy, but somehow, she knew she was no longer alone.